Across the country at the moment, median rents are sitting at about $520. So the way we describe a median is it's kind of the typical, it's the middle of the distribution. Half of people pay more than that, half are paying less. So, kind of what you might think of as an average, a typical, however you like to describe it. That's a big increase from what we saw a year ago. It's up 12% nearly. And, that's clearly extremely brisk growth. In a bit of a change from what we had been seeing for some of the past few years, that's now being led by Sydney and Melbourne, and particularly by Sydney and Melbourne units.
That's interesting. So what are we seeing in terms of prices for Sydney and Melbourne?
So Sydney and Melbourne have seen their unit rents up 20% nearly over the past 12 months, which is staggering growth. Now, part of the story there is unit rents in Sydney and Melbourne actually fell during the pandemic, particularly in Melbourne in 2020 and early 2021. In the inner Melbourne area, rents fell by as much as a quarter for units, which is a pretty substantial fall. So part of the story for why they're leading growth now is catching up for that period of underperformance, but it's certainly not all of it. And rents are now, for units in Sydney and Melbourne, quite a lot higher than they were pre-pandemic. They're 19% higher than they were in Sydney, and they're a little over 10% higher in Melbourne. So not just catching up for that pandemic period.
So if they're not just catching up, what are the other reasons for this really staggering increase?
Yeah, I mean, the simple and maybe a little bit flippant answer is there's just a lot of people that want to rent and not enough rentals going around at the moment. The way we like to measure this is what we call a rental vacancy rate, which measures the number of currently available rentals on realestate.com.au. It's sitting below 1.5 in a lot of parts of the country at the moment. It's at 1.3 in Melbourne. To give you a sense of just how tight it is. That's less than half what it was pre-pandemic, and means for every 100 renter households, there's only a little more than one currently available rental. That means when it does become available, it's leasing extremely quickly, it's very competitive, a lot of people are applying, and that means rents are going up as a result.
In terms of, so Melbourne and Sydney are leading the drive for these increases. What are some of the other capital cities doing? Are any of them staying the same or any of them falling? What are we seeing in the numbers?
Yeah, there's maybe some good news for renters in Brisbane and Adelaide, although I'd temper it with some. Brisbane saw rents up about 2% in the quarter, which is still pretty quick, to be clear, but it is the slowest pace of rent growth for Brisbane since mid-2021, so a couple years. So maybe signs that things are starting to slow down, still growing quickly, but maybe starting to slow down. In Adelaide, we actually saw rents flat in June. Now, rent growth can be a little bit volatile, so I don't want to read too much into just what we've seen in one quarter, but again, it's maybe a sign that things are starting to ease off. Both of those cities have had incredibly strong rental demand across the pandemic. We've seen a lot of people move there from Sydney and Melbourne. That's driven rents up very quickly. We're talking about how rents fell in Sydney and Melbourne in 2020 and 2021. That certainly didn't happen in Adelaide and Brisbane. So they've become much more expensive cities, but maybe we're starting to see some relief on the horizon for renters there.
And Angus, finally, what are we seeing in regional markets? Because during the pandemic, the regional, rentals, they were hard to find, prices absolutely skyrocketed. What are we seeing now?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Emma. It was pretty tough for regional renters. A bit like in Adelaide and Brisbane, we're maybe starting to see some signs that there's relief on the way. Rental vacancy rates have improved a bit over the past 12 to 18 months in regional areas. They're still low. It's still hard to find a rental, but it's not nearly as bad as it was 18 months ago. And that looks like it's starting to flow through to rents. Pace of rent growth has started to slow in regional areas. It's still up 6 to 7% over the past year, so that's still pretty quick, but we're not seeing the sort of double-digit growth that we were through much of the past 3 years.